A cold morning breeze brushed against the tall glass towers of the city as a young black woman walked toward one of the largest corporate offices downtown. She moved with quiet confidence, her heels clicking softly against the marble pavement. Her suit was elegant but not flashy, a simple black jacket with a soft white blouse. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face calm but determined. She was not a stranger to places like this. She had worked hard all her life to stand among powerful people, and today was supposed to be another important step in her journey. She entered the huge lobby, a space filled with polished floors, expensive paintings, and rushing people in expensive suits. The air smelled faintly of coffee and perfume, the kind of smell that lived in offices where big money decisions were made. She looked around for the reception desk, holding a slim black folder close to her chest. That folder contained documents, ideas, and plans that had taken her months to prepare. It wasn't just paper. It was her sweat, her late nights, her early mornings, her entire dream written in neat words. At the far end of the lobby, behind a glossy wooden counter, sat a young receptionist. The woman smiled brightly at others passing by, greeting men in expensive ties and women in designer coats. But when the black executive approached, that smile faded. The receptionist's eyes scanned her up and down, and the warmth she had just shown to others disappeared. "Yes?" the receptionist asked, her tone sharp. The executive returned the look calmly. "Good morning. I'm here for the business meeting scheduled on the top floor. My name is—" The receptionist cut her off before she could even finish. "I think you're in the wrong place. This office is not open to just anyone. Please leave." For a second, silence filled the space between them. The executive stood still, her fingers tightening slightly on the folder. She thought maybe she had misheard. Maybe the young woman was mistaken. She tried again, her voice calm but firmer this time. "There must be a misunderstanding. I have an appointment. If you could check the list," but again she was interrupted. The receptionist leaned forward, lowering her voice but sharpening her words like knives. "Look, I don't have time for games. People like you don't just walk in here asking for meetings. So why don't you get lost before I call security?" The words hit harder than she expected. For a moment, the executive felt her chest tighten, her pride bending under the weight of humiliation. People around the lobby turned their heads, curious about the small scene happening at the desk. Some whispered, some simply glanced and walked on. The executive could feel the heat rising in her face, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. She had been through worse before. She looked directly into the receptionist's eyes, not with anger, but with quiet strength. Then, without another word, she stepped back. She turned and walked out of the building. The morning air felt colder now, biting against her skin. She stood outside for a moment, holding her folder tighter, her heart heavy. Memories of her journey flashed in her mind. How many times she had been told she wasn't good enough, how often doors had been shut in her face. Yet she had always kept moving, always kept working, always kept believing that her time would come. What the receptionist didn't know was that the woman she had dismissed so carelessly was no ordinary visitor. She was one of the most powerful executives in her field, a woman whose signature could change the future of entire companies. She had walked into that building not as a beggar, not as a stranger, but as a decision-maker, someone the company desperately needed. But now, standing outside in the cold morning air, she made a silent decision of her own. She would not argue. She would not raise her voice. She would not waste her energy on someone who could not see her worth. Instead, she would let time reveal the truth. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward her car. The city roared around her, cars rushing, horns honking, people hurrying to work. Yet inside her heart there was only silence, the heavy silence of someone who had just been insulted but refused to be broken. She knew the receptionist had no idea who she was or what power she carried, and soon that ignorance would cost the company more than they could ever imagine. As the car door closed behind her, the executive placed the folder gently on the seat beside her. She glanced back at the towering building one last time. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in quiet determination. "They'll know," she thought. Not today, not right now, but they'll know soon enough. The driver started the engine, and the car pulled away from the glittering glass towers. The receptionist, still sitting at her desk upstairs, continued smiling at the next visitors, completely unaware of the storm she had just unleashed with her careless words. And so, the story truly began, with a single moment of disrespect that would soon grow into the destruction of an entire company. The night after the humiliating encounter, she sat alone in her quiet apartment, staring at the city lights through the window. The city never slept, but inside her home there was silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. The black folder she had carried so proudly that morning lay on the table, untouched since she returned. She reached out and ran her fingers over its surface, remembering how much of her life was written inside those pages. Her thoughts drifted back, far away from the polished glass buildings and business meetings, to a small neighborhood where she grew up. The streets there were cracked and dusty, the houses close together, and opportunities were rare. She remembered her mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. She remembered herself, a little girl, sitting by a broken lamp at night, trying to read books she borrowed from a small library. While other kids played outside, she drowned herself in learning, knowing deep inside that education was her way out. There were times she wanted to give up. Times when she saw her friends drop out of school, fall into trouble, or accept that life would never give them more than scraps. But she refused. She worked harder than anyone else, not because she had more talent, but because she had no choice. She dreamed of walking into tall buildings one day, not as a cleaner or assistant, but as someone who had a voice at the table, someone who could make decisions. Her journey had never been easy. Every step of the way, there had been voices telling her she didn't belong. Professors doubted her, colleagues questioned her, and competitors underestimated her. But each time she turned the doubt into fuel. Every failure became a lesson, every rejection a push to work harder. She built herself from nothing, brick by brick, until she stood taller than anyone had expected. Now, as she sat in her apartment, she realized why the receptionist's words hurt so deeply. It wasn't just the insult, it was the reminder of every single moment in her past, when people had judged her by her skin, by her gender, by her background. That young woman at the desk didn't know her story, didn't care to ask. She saw only what she wanted to see, and in a moment of arrogance, dismissed her as if she were invisible. But the executive was not invisible. She had built a reputation in her industry, not just for her intelligence, but for her resilience. She had earned respect through sweat and sacrifice. She wasn't a woman who demanded pity. She was a woman who demanded results, and she delivered them. As the clock ticked on, she leaned back in her chair and thought about the company that had just slammed its doors in her face. She knew their history, their projects, their weaknesses. She knew their arrogance wasn't limited to one rude receptionist. It was part of their culture. They had grown too comfortable, too proud, believing they were untouchable. But no company is untouchable forever. She remembered something her late father once told her when she was just a teenager. Respect is free to give, but it can cost everything if you refuse it. At the time, she hadn't fully understood those words. Tonight, they rang in her ears like a warning bell. That company had refused respect, not only to her, but likely to many others before her. And now she realized the cost would soon come. Still, she didn't allow bitterness to take over her heart. She didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. What she wanted was justice, a chance to show the world, and perhaps even the receptionist, that dismissing someone without knowing their worth could be the greatest mistake of all. The next morning, she woke up early, dressed sharply, and prepared herself for another meeting. This one wasn't in the same office as yesterday. It was in a grand hall filled with investors, decision-makers, and people whose opinions could shape the future of companies. She looked at her reflection in the mirror before leaving. Her eyes were calm, her shoulders strong. The humiliation from the day before hadn't broken her. It had sharpened her, She arrived at the venue, walked past crowds of men and women rushing to take their seats, and entered with quiet dignity. Unlike the receptionist, the people here knew who she was. Some turned to greet her warmly, others whispered her name with respect. She shook hands, exchanged smiles, and carried herself like the leader she had become. But in her mind, she carried the memory of yesterday. Not as pain, but as purpose. She wasn't just here for herself anymore. She was here to prove a point that went beyond business. She was here to prove that dignity, respect, and perseverance were stronger than arrogance and prejudice. As she took her place at the front of the hall, preparing to speak, she knew that the receptionist's words would echo in her story forever. But soon, the world would see her not as the woman told to get lost, but as the woman who held the power to decide which companies would rise and which would fall. And deep inside, she knew the company that had rejected her would soon face a storm they never saw coming. The company that had dismissed her so casually stood tall in the city's skyline, its logo shining brightly at the top of a sleek glass tower. On the outside, it looked flawless. Modern offices, stylish employees, expensive cars parked out front. People passing by admired it as a symbol of wealth and power. But behind the glossy walls and the carefully crafted image, there was a darker truth that only a few insiders dared to whisper about. The company had built its empire on arrogance. The leaders at the top believed they were invincible, that no competitor could touch them. Their board meetings were filled with proud speeches about dominance, not discussions about values or respect. They chased money with ruthless speed, cutting corners and mistreating anyone they thought was below them. Employees who raised concerns were silenced or pushed out. Smaller businesses that tried to work with them were often crushed under unfair deals. It wasn't just confidence. It was cruelty, disguised as strength. The receptionist who told the executive to get lost was only a reflection of the culture inside. She had learned her attitude from watching how the higher-ups treated people. In her eyes, someone who didn't look like a billionaire wasn't worth the time. That same mindset was shared by many managers and executives within the company. They believed appearances were everything and that respect was only reserved for those who looked powerful. Inside the office floors, whispers of dissatisfaction grew. Many employees worked long hours, barely seeing their families. Their ideas were ignored, their efforts taken for granted. A few brave workers spoke about quitting, but most stayed because they needed the paycheck. The leaders at the top never noticed, or maybe they simply didn't care. As long as the profits rose, they thought everything was fine, but the truth was, cracks had already begun forming in the foundation. Their finances looked strong, but behind the polished reports were debts piling higher each quarter. They had taken risks, signed reckless deals, and silenced anyone who dared to question them. Outsiders didn't know the details, but those inside the company could sense the tension. Like a storm waiting to break, on the other side of the city, the black executive sat quietly with her own team, reviewing the documents in her folder. She knew more about the company than they realized. She had studied their moves, followed their deals, and uncovered their weaknesses. Unlike them, she valued respect and relationships, and because of that she had built allies, powerful allies who trusted her word. She didn't need to shout about her strength. Her influence spoke for itself. She thought back to the moment in the lobby when the receptionist's voice cut her like a blade. In truth, she didn't blame the young woman entirely. The receptionist was just a mirror of the arrogance that lived in the company's veins. That culture of pride and prejudice had grown unchecked for years, and now it was about to destroy them from the inside out. Meanwhile, inside the tower, the executives gathered around a long, polished table for a board meeting. They boasted about their upcoming expansion, laughed at smaller competitors, and ignored the subtle warnings in their financial reports. One man raised a concern about partnerships falling through and investors pulling back, but his words were drowned out by louder voices. "We are untouchable," the CEO declared, slamming his hand on the table. "No one can bring us down." But outside that room, the world was shifting. Investors were growing impatient. Clients were exploring other options. Rumors were spreading about the company's unethical behavior. The black executive knew these whispers, and she also knew that she was in a position to confirm them, to shine a light on what the company had tried so hard to hide. That evening, as the city lights glowed against the night sky, the receptionist locked up her desk. She thought nothing of the encounter that morning. To her, the woman she had dismissed was just another forgettable face. She went home, watched television, and scrolled through her phone, never realizing that the very same woman was preparing to meet with powerful investors the next morning, investors who held the keys to the company's survival. The company was still standing tall, but the foundation was already cracking. Its leaders were blind, its workers exhausted, and its arrogance unchecked. They thought they had pushed away an unimportant visitor, but in truth, they had insulted the very person who could decide their fate, and as the executive reviewed her plans late into the night, she felt no rush for revenge. She didn't want to destroy them out of anger. She wanted the world to see the truth. She wanted their downfall to be their own doing, a direct result of their arrogance and disrespect. All she had to do was take one step, and the dominoes would fall. The next chapter of their story was already written. It was only a matter of time before everyone else would. Reddit, the morning sun, streamed through the tall windows of the conference hall, lighting up rows of chairs filled with some of the most powerful investors and decision-makers in the city. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a gathering where companies lived or died based on a single presentation, a single decision, or even a single signature. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet tension, as men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses whispered to one another about deals worth millions. At the front of the hall, a large stage stood ready, lined with long tables, microphones, and stacks of reports. Each company that had been invited would have its turn to speak, to defend its strategies, and to convince the investors that they were worth trusting. Among those listed to present was the very company that had dismissed the black executive the day before. They didn't know it yet, but their biggest obstacle was already in the room, seated calmly at one of the tables, holding the very folder the receptionist had mocked. The executive arrived early, as she always did. She greeted familiar faces, shook hands with allies, and exchanged a few words with those who had long respected her wisdom. There was no trace of the humiliation she had endured yesterday. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her eyes sharp, her movements steady. To the investors, she was a figure of authority, a woman whose opinion could shape their decisions. To the company that had disrespected her, she was still an unknown danger. When the meeting began, representatives of different firms stepped up one by one. Some spoke confidently, others nervously, but each was judged carefully. When it was finally the turn of the arrogant company, their CEO walked onto the stage with a proud stride. He spoke with the same confidence he always did, painting a picture of endless growth, unstoppable progress, and unmatched dominance. His words were smooth, his smile polished, but behind the charm was a man who had grown blind to reality. The investors listened politely, but some exchanged doubtful glances. They had heard whispers, rumors about mismanagement and mistreatment, but none of them had concrete proof. The CEO, unaware of their hesitation, boasted louder, promising bigger profits and brighter futures. He ended his speech with a smile, as if victory was already in his pocket. Then came the moment that shifted the air in the room. The chairperson turned to the black executive and asked her opinion. The hall grew quiet. Everyone knew her words carried weight. She stood slowly, walked to the microphone, and opened the folder she had carried with such care. Her voice was calm, steady, and sharp. She didn't attack the company with insults or anger. She presented facts. She revealed patterns of reckless spending, hidden debts, and unfair treatment of smaller firms. She pointed to evidence that the company had cut corners, manipulated numbers, and silenced employees who dared to speak the truth. Her words were not loud, but they carried the weight of truth, and every sentence struck harder than the last. The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident smile beginning to fade. The investors leaned forward, listening closely. Some nodded, recognizing pieces of information they had suspected but never confirmed. The executive continued, her professionalism shining. She wasn't here to humiliate anyone. She was here to protect the future of the investors and expose what needed to be exposed. By the time she finished, the room was silent. The investors looked at each other, their decision already clear. The company that had claimed to be invincible was now standing on shaky ground. Their arrogance had been revealed for what it truly was, a mask hiding weakness. The CEO tried to defend himself, stammering about misunderstandings and false accusations, but the damage was done. His words no longer carried weight. The investors had heard enough. They trusted the executive's judgment more than his empty promises. As she returned to her seat, people around her whispered words of respect. Some leaned over to shake her hand, thanking her for her honesty and clarity. She accepted their gestures with grace, never once glancing toward the CEO or thinking of the receptionist who had dismissed her. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any revenge could. Her actions spoke louder than any revenge could. Across the room, the company's representatives sat in silence, their faces pale. For the first time, they felt the sting of being powerless. The empire they had built on pride was beginning to crumble, not because of an angry enemy, but because the truth had finally been spoken by someone they had underestimated. When the session ended, the executive stepped out of the hall into the bright daylight. She inhaled deeply, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs. She had not shouted, she had not argued, and she had not lowered herself to anger. She had simply done what she always did. She had let her strength, her preparation, and her dignity speak for her. Behind her, the company's leaders scrambled to save face, making frantic phone calls and whispering desperate plans. But deep down, they knew the storm had already begun. Their downfall had been set in motion, and there was no easy way to stop it. The executive walked to her car, her steps steady and sure. She thought of the receptionist once more, the young woman who had looked at her with disdain and told her to get lost. A small smile crossed her lips. The receptionist had no idea that in trying to dismiss her, she had unknowingly dismissed the very person who could decide her company's fate. Now, that fate was sealed. The days following the investor meeting were filled with quiet but powerful ripples across the city's business circles. What the black executive had revealed was not easily forgotten. Her words had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of investors, and those seeds were already beginning to grow. Calls were made, contracts were reviewed, and for the first time in years, the once proud company faced a spotlight it could not control. The executive, however, did not rush. She didn't celebrate, nor did she openly speak about what happened. Instead, she worked with precision, like a master chess player planning her next move. She knew that the strongest victories were not won with anger, but with calm, careful calculation. She gathered her trusted team in a quiet office overlooking the city. They spread documents across the table, analyzing every deal, every contract, every hidden number in the company's records. "We don't destroy them with noise," she told her colleagues. "We let the truth speak for itself." Her words were firm, her eyes steady. Her team admired her not only for her intelligence, but for her ability to remain composed, even when the stakes were high. In the meantime, the arrogant company scrambled behind closed doors. Their CEO, once confident and untouchable, now barked orders at his staff with desperation. Meetings grew heated. Managers whispered about layoffs, and employees carried a heavy sense of fear in the hallways. No one dared say it out loud, but they all knew. The executive's exposure of their weaknesses had cut deeper than anyone realized. The receptionist, the same young woman who had told the executive to get lost, carried on with her routine, mostly unaware of how serious things had become. But even she noticed the change in the air. Fewer smiles filled the office. Executives walked past her without their usual arrogance. She didn't yet know that the stranger she had dismissed so carelessly was the very person now tightening the walls around her company. Back in her own office, the executive prepared her next step. She scheduled private meetings with investors who trusted her judgment. She didn't exaggerate or seek revenge. She calmly showed them data, pointed out trends, and explained how putting money into the arrogant company was no longer safe. She didn't tell them what to do. She let them decide for themselves. And one by one, they began to withdraw support. The executive also reached out to smaller firms that had been mistreated by the company in the past. Many of them had stories of unfair contracts, of being bullied or pushed out of deals. These stories had been ignored for years, but now, under her guidance, they found a voice. She helped them gather their evidence, making sure everything was clean, honest, and professional. It wasn't about destroying one company. It was about lifting up those who had been silenced. Her moves were quiet, but deadly. Each action she took was like pulling a single thread from a woven cloth, and with each pull, the company's image began to unravel. Contracts dissolved, partnerships weakened, and loyal clients began exploring safer options. Meanwhile, newspapers and business journals caught wind of the story. Headlines began to appear, questioning the company's future. Reporters hinted at financial instability, at possible scandals hidden beneath the surface. No one yet knew the full truth, but suspicion was enough to shake the company's reputation. Investors hated uncertainty, and uncertainty now surrounded every corner of their empire. The CEO grew restless. He called emergency board meetings, promising his team that they could recover, but even his own directors began to doubt him. His speeches, once filled with power, now sounded hollow. "We'll fight this," he declared, slamming his fist on the table. But deep down, he knew he was fighting against a storm too large to control. Through all this, the executive remained composed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat, and didn't seek to humiliate. She knew true power wasn't about shouting. It was about being the calmest person in the room when everyone else was panicking. Her patience became her weapon, her dignity, her shield. Late one evening, as she walked out of her office, she paused to look at the glowing skyline. Among the lights, the arrogant company's tower still stood tall, its logo shining against the night. But she could already see what others could not, the cracks running through its foundation, cracks that no amount of money could fix. Her assistant asked her quietly, "Do you think they realize yet?" The executive gave a faint smile. "Not fully," she replied. "But they will, soon." The receptionist, still clueless, would go home that night thinking she had done nothing more than send away a stranger. The CEO would go home telling himself he still had control. But the truth was clear. The company had already begun to collapse, and it was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. The executive didn't need to destroy them with her hands. She had simply revealed the truth and let their own flaws do the work. And as she closed the door to her office that night, she knew this was only the beginning. The storm she had unleashed was still gathering strength. What came next would not just weaken the company, it would shatter it completely. The following weeks were a blur of fast-moving events, each one pushing the arrogant company closer to its inevitable downfall. What had started as a quiet exposure of financial mismanagement and internal flaws had grown into a full-blown crisis. The executive, who had once been dismissed so callously by the receptionist, now watched with quiet satisfaction as the truth spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. It began with the investors. One by one, they began pulling their support from the company, citing concerns over the integrity of the leadership and the sustainability of their operations. The withdrawal of major investors sent shockwaves through the financial world. News outlets picked up the story, their headlines filled with speculation about the company's future. The once untouchable giant now looked fragile, vulnerable to the shifting winds of public opinion. The CEO, a man who had once carried himself with such arrogance, found himself scrambling for answers. He called meeting after meeting with his board members, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. But the truth was, the company was already unraveling, and no amount of denial or optimistic speeches could patch the growing cracks. The investors weren't just pulling back their money, they were pulling away from the company's toxic culture, from the unethical business practices that had been allowed to fester for so long. The media turned its attention to the company's darker secrets. Reports emerged detailing shady business dealings, unfair contracts, and employees who had been silenced or fired for speaking out. Whistleblowers who had once been too afraid to speak up now found themselves emboldened, and they shared their stories with reporters who were eager to expose the company's rot. The corporate facade that had been so carefully crafted over the years began to crumble, piece by piece. For the black executive, the process was almost surgical. She didn't need to push the company's demise further. It was already in motion. Her role had been simple: to present the truth, to shine a light on the company's failures, and to let them implode under their own weight. She had never sought revenge. All she wanted was to see justice done, to show the world that even the most powerful corporations couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. The receptionist, who had once dismissed the executive with such casual cruelty, sat at her desk day after day, watching the changes unfold. She had no idea how deep the executive's influence went or how much power she truly held. To the receptionist, the company was still as strong as ever. But as the weeks passed, she began to feel the tension in the air. The smiles from her colleagues grew fewer. The once confident executives now seemed unsure, their faces etched with worry. The atmosphere in the office had shifted, and it was clear that something was terribly wrong. One afternoon, the receptionist overheard a conversation between two senior executives. They spoke in hushed tones, clearly agitated. "We need to stop this before it goes any further," one of them said. "But how? The investors are gone. The clients are leaving. We can't cover up everything anymore. The other executive sighed deeply. "We thought we were invincible. We thought we could do whatever we wanted. But now we're going to pay for it." The receptionist's heart skipped a beat as she realized just how bad things had become. She hadn't known all the details, but the unease in the office was undeniable. The company was falling apart, and she had no idea that the executive she had so casually dismissed had been the catalyst for this chain of events. Back in the executive's office, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. She had set everything into motion, and now she watched with a steady calm as the company faced the consequences of its actions. Investors had pulled out, lawsuits had been filed. Journalists had uncovered every dark secret the company had tried to hide. The final blow came when one of the company's largest clients, a major player in the industry, severed its relationship with them. The public was beginning to realize what had been going on behind the scenes, and the company's reputation had been shattered beyond repair. The CEO, now a shadow of the confident man he once was, held a press conference to try to salvage what was left of the company's dignity. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the world was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. The questions from reporters were sharp, relentless. They asked about the accusations, about the financial instability, about the mistreatment of employees. Each question exposed another layer of the company's corruption, and the CEO could only stammer his way through, unable to regain control of the narrative. Behind the scenes, the executive watched the press conference unfold on her laptop. She didn't need to hear the CEO's words to know that the company was done for. She had already won. Not through force or loud speeches, but through a quiet, strategic unveiling of the truth. The company's fate was sealed, and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. The final blow came a few days later when the company announced it would be filing for bankruptcy. The board of directors resigned, one after the other, as the full scale of their mistakes became apparent. It was a bitter end for a company that had once thought itself untouchable. The executive didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in seeing them crumble, only a quiet sense of justice. As the company faded into history, the receptionist found herself facing an uncertain future. She had been part of the company's downfall, and while she had never understood the full scope of what had been happening, she now realized the consequences of her actions. She had dismissed someone she hadn't understood, and that mistake had cost the company everything. For the black executive, the story was over, but the lesson remained. Respect, dignity, and truth were powerful forces, and those who ignored them paid a steep price. She had never needed revenge. She had only needed to be patient and let the truth do its work. The company was gone, and its arrogance had been its undoing. In the end, the executive had proven that no one, not even the most powerful corporations, was above the consequences of their own actions. As the dust settled and the echoes of the company's collapse began to fade, the black executive found herself standing at the center of a new reality. The headlines had stopped, the media had moved on to the next big story, and the public had already begun to forget the name of the once mighty corporation that had fallen. But for her, this was never about fame, glory, or revenge. It was about something much more meaningful, about showing that dignity, respect, and integrity were the true measures of power. In the weeks following the company's bankruptcy, the executive received offers from all corners of the business world. CEOs of successful startups, financial institutions, and multinational corporations reached out to her, eager to have her join their teams. Her reputation as a visionary and a force for justice had spread far and wide. But despite the offers, she chose a different path, one that wasn't about high salaries or flashy titles. She chose to continue building what she had started. An organization dedicated to mentoring young leaders who shared her values of respect, honesty, and integrity. She knew that the work she had done to bring down a corrupt company was only part of her mission. The real work, she believed, was in empowering the next generation. She wanted to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated, that young men and women would rise in the business world, not by crushing others, but by lifting them up. Her new organization focused on providing mentorship to people from underrepresented communities, those who, like her, had faced obstacles in their lives, but never allowed them to stop their progress. She spoke at conferences, led workshops, and used her voice to inspire and empower those who had been told they didn't belong. Meanwhile, the receptionist, who had once dismissed her, struggled to find her place in the world now that the company was no more. She had been left behind in the rubble of arrogance and greed. Her position was now a distant memory, and she faced the reality of living in the wake of the destruction she had helped cause. She knew the company's fall had been inevitable, but a small part of her still felt the weight of her role in it. In the days after the bankruptcy, she had spoken to a few of her former colleagues. Most of them had already moved on, either finding work elsewhere or accepting that the company was no longer a part of their futures. She had been offered a chance to join a smaller firm, but nothing felt the same. She had watched as people who had once walked with arrogance and certainty now walked with regret. The reality of her actions, the disrespect she had shown to a person she had not understood, haunted her. She saw the black executive's name in the news occasionally, now tied to charitable causes and leadership initiatives. The executive's success wasn't measured by the destruction of a corporation, but by the way she used her power to help others rise. The receptionist knew she would never be able to undo the harm she had caused, but she could at least learn from her mistakes. She started seeking out books on leadership, respect, and diversity, hoping to understand the very things she had once dismissed so easily. Meanwhile, the black executive's journey continued. Her efforts didn't stop at mentorship. She had begun advising young entrepreneurs and investors, guiding them on ethical business practices and long-term sustainability. She spoke often about the importance of treating everyone with respect, no matter their background or appearance. Her success was now measured not in dollars or prestige, but in the lives she had touched, the young leaders she had mentored, and the communities she had helped to build. Her name became synonymous with integrity in a world that often valued profit over people. She was no longer the woman dismissed by a receptionist in a sterile lobby. She was a symbol of change, a living example of how character and patience could bring about a powerful transformation. Her story was one that inspired countless others, especially women of color who had faced the same struggles she once had. She gave them hope, showing them that it was possible to overcome obstacles and reach the top without losing their dignity along the way. She made it clear that success didn't have to come at the expense of others, and that true leaders empowered those around them. One evening, years after the collapse of the company, the executive received a letter. It was from the receptionist. The letter was brief but heartfelt. In it, the receptionist apologized for her actions, acknowledging the disrespect she had shown that day in the lobby. She thanked the executive for being a model of strength, grace, and humility, even in the face of cruelty. It was a simple letter, but it carried weight, an acknowledgement of the lessons learned and a desire to move forward with a more open heart. The executive read the letter quietly, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. She didn't hold grudges. She never had. She believed that everyone deserved a chance to change, to learn, and to grow. The receptionist had taken that step, and that was all that mattered. As the executive put the letter down, she thought back to that day in the lobby. She remembered the sting of the words and the humiliation, but she also remembered how she had walked away with dignity, how she had kept her head high, and how in the end it wasn't her who had fallen. It was the company that had underestimated her. The legacy she left behind wasn't one of destruction, but one of empowerment, integrity, and change. And that was a legacy that would endure far longer than any company could. Years passed, and the black executive's story became one that was whispered in business circles and shared in classrooms. Her name was no longer associated with a corporation's downfall or the bitterness of revenge. It was synonymous with leadership, transformation, and the power of resilience. Her journey had become a blueprint for those who sought to make a difference without losing their integrity. And her legacy lived on in the lives of countless people she had helped to rise. Her organization, dedicated to mentoring young leaders, had flourished beyond what she had ever imagined. The foundation she had built now served hundreds of aspiring entrepreneurs, educators, and community organizers from underrepresented backgrounds. The executive's mentorship had become a sought-after resource, with people from all over the world reaching out for guidance. She had created a network of leaders who were determined not just to succeed, but to do so ethically, with respect for all people, regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. One of the most rewarding parts of her work was watching her mentees thrive. Many of them had faced the same obstacles she had, and as they rose to positions of power and influence, they carried the lessons she had taught them, that leadership was about service, that integrity mattered more than profit, and that true success was measured by the positive impact one had on the world. As the years went on, her story was shared more widely. It appeared in books about leadership and resilience, in articles about diversity in the workplace, and in TED Talks that reached millions. Her words, her actions, and her philosophy became the foundation for a new wave of business leaders, ones who understood that profit was important, but not at the expense of people. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing the progress of a new mentorship program for young women of color, her phone buzzed with an unexpected notification. A documentary filmmaker had reached out, asking to tell her story. They wanted to capture not just the corporate collapse she had played a role in, but the transformation she had inspired in the business world. At first, she hesitated. She had never sought the spotlight. Her journey had always been about doing the right thing, not about personal fame. But after some thought, she realized that her story could serve as a powerful reminder that one person could change the world. That strength didn't always mean loud voices or anger. and that even the smallest acts of defiance could set something much larger into motion. The documentary was released a year later, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before. It wasn't just a story about corporate corruption. It was a story of personal growth, of rising from rejection, of using setbacks as stepping stones. It followed her from the humblest beginnings to becoming a leader who had turned the business world upside down, showing that true power lay in humility and service to others. As the documentary gained attention, people from all walks of life reached out to her. Students wrote letters expressing how her journey had changed their perspective on leadership. Young women shared their stories of overcoming obstacles, using the lessons she had imparted to break barriers in industries that had long been closed to them. Even those who had once dismissed her, like the receptionist from the now defunct company, had come to understand the power of respect and the cost of underestimating someone based on appearance or background. One afternoon, she received a letter that caught her off guard. It was from the receptionist, the same woman who had once told her to get lost in the lobby of that towering office building. The letter was short but heartfelt, filled with words of apology and gratitude. The receptionist admitted that she had spent years reflecting on her actions and the company's collapse, realizing how much damage had been done by a culture that devalued people based on their outward appearance. She thanked the executive for showing her what true strength was, and she asked for her forgiveness. The executive smiled as she read the letter. She had never held any grudges, never looked back in anger. To her, this was just another step in the cycle of growth that she had begun all those years ago. She knew that the receptionist, like so many others, had learned from her mistakes, and that was all she had ever hoped for. A few weeks later, the receptionist reached out again, this time with an invitation. She had started her own non-profit, focused on providing opportunities for young women in the workforce. She asked the executive to be a keynote speaker at their first annual conference. It was an invitation that filled the executive's heart with warmth. She agreed without hesitation, knowing that her journey had come full circle when she stood at the podium at that conference, looking out at the crowd of eager young faces. She felt a sense of pride that went beyond anything she had achieved in the corporate world. These were the people who would carry her message forward, who would lead with integrity, who would never forget the lessons learned from her journey. Her story had come full circle, and the seeds she had planted years ago had now grown into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. She had created a legacy, not just through the company's collapse or the lessons of the past, but through the lives she had touched, the leaders she had empowered, and the world that was slowly beginning to change because of her actions. And as she looked out at the crowd, she realized that this moment was the true measure of her success. It wasn't about revenge or recognition, or even the downfall of an arrogant company. It was about the lives she had touched and the change she had brought into the world. Her journey was far from over. But now it was no longer just her journey. It was the journey of everyone she had helped along the way.